Alrighty, guys. So we are still talking about Andrew Jackson's time as president, and today we're going to get to an event in American history that is not really something that we're super proud of. This is the Indian Removal Act. A lot of Native Americans were still living more on the East Coast, on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. The main tribes there are the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, all living mostly in the southeastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. These tribes are not really what you would typically picture stereotypically when you think of Native Americans. They have, for the most part, really adopted a lot of the customs and a lot of the practices of, like, American settlers. They dressed very similar. They built similar homes. They've written their own constitutions. They've created their own written languages, their own governments. They were known as by the Americans as the 5 civilized tribes, because they were the tribes that had adopted ways that were more similar to American settlers. However, there are a lot of Americans who don't like having these guys here. We've signed treaties with these Native Americans saying that they will be able to keep their own lands. Like, we have set aside like specific tracts of land for these tribes to live on. And a lot of American settlers want their land and are pushing for the federal government to relocate them somewhere else. Somebody in the government who's a huge supporter of this was Andrew Jackson. He wanted to push these people out west into the area known as the Great Plains, which is in that picture, everything that's shaded red is the Great Plains. He wants to push them further out west there. Americans are currently at the point where they believed that area to be mostly a wasteland, and very few people wanted to live there because it's very brown, it's very dry, very cold in the winter, and so just a lot of people are like, oh, we'll never want to move there, so if we shove them out there, it'll be fine. Like, we'll be able to take their land and they'll have that land that we don't want out there. But whenever people find out that that area is actually very, very fertile, they're going to get pushed out there as well. The Cherokee hear what's happening, and they're starting to try to find like legal ways to resist it. Jackson pushes a law called the Indian Removal Act through Congress, and it passes in both houses. Now, what this law would allow them to do was it would allow the government to pay Native Americans for their land in order to move out west into what is today Oklahoma. And the money that they were offering was less than 5% of what the property was actually worth. And just to give you an idea of why they wouldn't want to move out west into Oklahoma, here's the kind of territory that the Cherokee specifically are used to living in. This is where their families have been living for hundreds of years now. And this is Oklahoma. It's about as opposite of a place to Georgia as you can get. And they don't want to live there. They don't know what it takes or what it's required to live out in Oklahoma. They know how to live in Georgia, and that's where they want to stay. A lot of Native Americans, when representatives from the government come and knock on their door and show them this Indian Removal Act and offer, hey, we'll buy your land if you give it to us, felt kind of forced, like they were being pushed to it. Because oftentimes it would be soldiers holding guns saying, hey, you want to sell us your land? And it just felt more like a threat than anything else. But they've already made these treaties with the government saying that, like, we're essentially like a separate country. You have no jurisdiction or power here. You can't kick us out of here. We have all these treaties that you signed with us. You're the ones who wrote those treaties. And so most of them refuse to sell. Georgia refuses to accept the Cherokee status as a separate country. And so they went ahead and made the Cherokee land part of their state. You can see in the map up at the top, Georgia was all the brown territory, and the territory that belonged to the Cherokee was all the green. And as soon as they kind of absorbed the Cherokee territory, they started enforcing all these laws in the Cherokee Nation. They started putting out a curfew for people who were Cherokee. You couldn't testify in court anymore. Like, there were all these different things, and they would arrest you if they found you, like, out after curfew, but there were a lot of other laws and regulations that they started enforcing in the Cherokee Nation. It would almost be like if police officers from Canada came down into the United States and started enforcing their laws here in our territory. We wouldn't put up with it either, and neither did the Cherokee. A big, well, not really a theory, but maybe one of the motivations that kind of explains why Georgia would want to take Cherokee's territory is if you look up at that map, those little yellow squares you see all over the map are places where gold was found in Georgia. And so that might have been a pretty hefty motivation for Georgia to take the Cherokee territory. The Cherokee, though, despite the fact that many people are pushing for, like, let's just start fighting back, like, let's break this out into violence, know that if they decided to go up in a straight out fight with the government, it's not going to end well, and it's just going to give them more of an excuse to push them out faster. And so they decide to go the legal route. They go to the Supreme Court just like anybody else would if they felt like the government was doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And in a court case known as Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time was a guy named John Marshall. Sorry, I can't talk today. John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no right to interfere with the Cherokee and they needed to back off. Now, the Supreme Court has made their decision. And if you remember, the branch of government that's in charge of enforcing those decisions is the executive branch, meaning the president, meaning Andrew Jackson, who wants this to happen. And so Andrew Jackson does not do what his basic job is in the executive branch, which is to enforce the law, and ignores the ruling. And he says to John Marshall, like, you've made your decision, you can enforce it. I'm not going to do anything about this. And because of that, it leaves the Cherokee in kind of a weird spot. They don't really know what to do. Some of them want to let's just go ahead and sell. Like, things are going to turn out badly. They're going to start kicking us out by force. If we don't sell, let's just go ahead and do it. Let's cave into what they want to do. Some of them are like, we need to start fighting back. Like, we tried the legal route and it didn't work. They're not going to listen to us and they're going to kick us out anyway. Let's just pick up our guns and let's fight. And then some of the others just want to try any other legal means possible. And while they're kind of all arguing what to do, an extremely small number of them, about 500 people, which was less than 3% of all the Cherokee, signed a treaty with the federal government agreeing to give up everybody's land. And this was known as the Treaty of New Echota. New Echota was the essentially capital of the Cherokee territory. And despite the fact that this only made up less than 3% of the Cherokee, they decided to vote on it in the Senate. A lot of people objected to this treaty, saying, this doesn't speak for all the Cherokee. There were 17,000 Cherokee in the Cherokee Nation, and less than 500 of them, which again is less than 3% of everybody, give away everybody's land. They said, that's not fair. They shouldn't be able to make that decision. However, the Senate voted on it, and they approved of the treaty by one vote. And so because of that, everybody's going to have to leave their land and move out west into Oklahoma. The government gave everybody a deadline, said if you are not out of here by this deadline, you will be escorted out. So a small number of them packed up everything and got out as soon as possible, but the rest of them thought, we should be able to fight this. Let's take this to court and let's fight back against this. Let's argue it. But by the time the due date came around, they were not able to change anybody's mind. Soldiers started rounding up the remaining Cherokee and started forcing them to march west, and this became known as the Trail of Tears. After rounding everybody up, they kind of forced them to move out west to different places along the Mississippi River, where they would have to stay in what were essentially concentration camps, all packed in together. These different colored arrows that you see here are the routes that these different tribes were forced to march to get to Oklahoma. All the darker green areas were the places where these natives had been staying and living before they were forced to relocate into Oklahoma. Between 1830 and 1850, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Muskegee, and the Seminole were rounded up into these temporary concentration camps. And they had to stay there for a few weeks because they would round people up into groups of about 1,000 and then force them to march west with an armed escorts. Like soldiers would be riding alongside them, making sure nobody tried to leave, nobody tried to double back, and that nobody tried to, like, you know, stay where they weren't supposed to be. But everybody else, while you were waiting for your group's turn, would have to stay in these very cramped camps, and you were only able to take with you what you could carry, so supplies were extremely limited. Disease alone killed about 2,000 people in these camps, and this is before people even started walking. Somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 people died along the way out of the 14,000 Cherokee who were relocated. Jackson had this to say about the Indian removal. It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages. As far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, this was a great thing because it benefited him and his other southern plantation-owning friends who now have all this extra land to expand their plantations into. This image here is the image that you're going to be using to complete the art analysis handout on Google Classroom. Or if you are an in-class student, there is a paper copy that you will be completing. So make sure you analyze that. Now, I don't want you to think that all the Native American tribes kind of just like rolled over and accepted this immediately. A lot of other Native Americans did not want to move. However, out of the, again, 5 civilized tribes, those first 5 that we talked about, the Seminole are the only ones to successfully resist removal. They refused to sign any treaties with the government and decide, like, we've been fighting to stay here for this long, might as well just keep going. And they're led by this guy, Osceola. Now, if you live in Lake City, you've probably heard of Osceola National Forest. It's not too far away. It is named after this guy. This is a really good quote from him during this time of how he planned to resist removal. And he says, "I will make the white man red with blood and then blacken him in the sun and rain." He was not just going to take this lying down. The Seminole Wars that exploded from this were attacked by troops led by a guy named Major Francis Dade. It was known as the Dade Massacre. They killed almost everybody in the village that they found. This is also where we kind of first see what are known as the Black Seminole, which are the descendants of the first Seminoles and runaway African-American slaves that made up the original Seminole tribe. Many of them have had children together, and so these Black Seminole are the descendants of those 2 groups. They used a lot of guerrilla warfare, hiding behind trees, hiding in bushes and in the brush, popping out to fire a little bit and then run away and lead them deeper into the forests and swamps in Florida. As time went on, they were pushed further and further into Florida before finally escaping into the Everglades, and they just were not able to remove the majority of them from that swamp, and so they just kind of left them there. But the same cannot be said for all the other Native Americans who were not able to resist removal. The people who were forced out west into Oklahoma traded 100 million acres for about 32 million. That's like if you owned a piece of territory the size of California and then were reduced to something the size of New York State. White settlement will eventually also spread into Oklahoma, and they'll also be forced out of there as well. The territory they've been moved to has already been claimed by Native American tribes, and they don't really take too kindly to a bunch of essentially strangers suddenly showing up in their territory. Again, this is thousands of people, and these Plains Native Americans are going to have issue with that. And from their point of view, like, these people have just kind of invaded their territory because they have no way of understanding that they've been forced to come here. The Americans built forts and promised to protect the people that they've kind of dumped off here from any attacks by the Plains Indians, but don't really do so much about that. The forts are mostly there to make sure that these people stay on the territory they've been dumped into. And issues over how they were removed and disagreements about what they should have done differently are going to divide these people for a long time. There are lots of monuments all over the place in the United States along the Trail of Tears. This one is in Chattanooga, Tennessee. These are pictures that I took when I visited there many years ago now. But it is a staircase, and down the staircase is like a fountain. It's like a small waterfall. It's not going fast enough, and you can walk along the staircase here, and it's not going fast enough that it'll like push you down the steps. But it's to represent the beginning of the Trail of Tears for the group that lived here, the Cherokee. The waterfall runs down the steps to a little pool down at the bottom, and along the walls there are these different medallions that represent different stories of the Cherokee, including that one in the middle with the spider. This is kind of the story of how winter ended and how the spring began. And the story essentially goes that one year, there was just terribly cold winter, and all the animals were extremely cold and they didn't know what to do. They were starting to freeze, and all of a sudden across this giant river there was this large tree that got struck by lightning and it caught on fire, and they were all very excited and were trying to figure out, how do we get the fire from over there to here? Some of them, they sent a bear over there, and the bear tried to carry some of the embers in its paws and it just couldn't. A raven tried to fly over there and pick up some of the coals and carry it back. And ravens, according to the story, used to be rainbow colored, but all the smoke and all the ash kind of darkened the raven forever, which is why ravens and crows kind of have that, when the light hits them, they have that kind of rainbow look under the black feathers. And so finally the animal that was able to go over there was the spider. The spider is a very important kind of character that pops up a lot in Cherokee myths. And the spider wove this little basket onto her back and walked across the surface of the water and picked up one very small ember and put it in the basket on her back, and then carried it back across, and they were able to use that to create fire. The Cherokee have reservations all over the Southeast. And if you ever get a chance to go, it's extremely cool. All the signs there have 3 different versions of the same words written on them. One is in their own written language. The second thing will usually be how that is pronounced, and then it'll also have it in English. They developed their own written language because they didn't want to just use English letters. That wouldn't be, it wouldn't be part of them. That was just an English thing. And they want to have their own written language, and it's extremely pretty to look at. And here's a good example of kind of how their written language kind of breaks down. It's not all just individual letters. Some of it are certain sounds, like H-E or H-I kind of sounds. And they all have their own written character. If you ever get a chance to visit one of these places, I know they're in Tennessee. North Carolina has a pretty large one. It's a town that's just called Cherokee. I highly encourage that you go and visit because there's a lot of history there. And I've talked about this before. America's not always the good guy, but that's why we study history, is so that we don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And this was a pretty big mistake that we made. And it's one that still affects people living in the United States today. I'm going to post with these notes a link to a website where you can learn more information about the Cherokee and kind of click through and read about that if you're interested. But if you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you all next time.